If part 1 was the warm-up, part 2 is where everyone goes all in. Stuck against Britain, Hitler made his craziest gamble, backstabbing his temporary ally, the Soviet Union. At the same time in the Pacific, Japan decided to awaken the American giant with a stunning blow at Pearl Harbor. These two fateful punches turned the conflict into a true world war. Welcome back to part 2, where the game goes global and becomes deadlier than ever. History's greatest U-turn. Germany backstabs the Soviet Union. While busy with verbal and aerial duels with Britain, Hitler was secretly preparing for a much crazier and grander plan. He had always considered the Soviet Union his ultimate ideological enemy. The non-aggression pact was just a temporary truce to free up his hands to deal with the West. Hitler's ultimate goal was to seize the fertile, living space in the East, destroy communism, and turn the Slavic peoples into slaves for the Aryan race. Stalin, despite receiving numerous intelligence reports warning that Germany was massing troops on the border, refused to believe it. He thought it was a British ploy to provoke a war between Germany and the USSR. Stalin continued to supply Germany with grain, oil, and raw materials as per the treaty. He believed Hitler wasn't foolish enough to open a second front before finishing off Britain. Stalin had gravely underestimated Hitler's madness. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers, along with thousands of tanks and aircraft, simultaneously attacked the Soviet Union on a front stretching for thousands of kilometers. It was the largest invasion in human history. The Soviet Red Army was caught completely by surprise. Stalin was reportedly so shocked by the news that he disappeared from public view for days. In the first few weeks, the German advance was lightning fast. They reapplied the blitzkrieg tactic, encircling and destroying hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers. German tanks pushed forward relentlessly toward 3 main objectives: Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and Ukraine, the breadbasket and oil fields, in the south. It seemed the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. German generals confidently predicted the war would be over before winter, but they had forgotten 2 of Russia's greatest generals, General Mud and General Winter. When autumn arrived, the rains turned Russia's dirt roads into a sea of mud, bogging down German tanks and trucks. The pace of the advance slowed dramatically. And then winter came. An unusually harsh winter. Temperatures dropped to -30, -40 degrees Celsius. The German soldiers, equipped only with summer uniforms because they expected a quick campaign, endured a frozen hell. Oil froze in the tanks, weapons jammed, and soldiers froze to death in droves. In contrast, the Red Army, accustomed to the cold, was equipped with winter uniforms and had ski troops from Siberia. Stalin, after his initial shock, regained his composure. He called upon the entire nation to join the Great Patriotic War. Factories were evacuated east of the Ural Mountains, working at full capacity to produce T-34 tanks and aircraft. At the gates of Moscow, the exhausted German army was stopped by a powerful Red Army counteroffensive. Blitzkrieg had failed. For the first time, Hitler had to order his army to switch to a defensive posture. The war in the East now turned into a brutal war of attrition, a giant meat grinder that would consume millions of lives. The sleeping giant is angered. Japan's grand entrance at Pearl Harbor. While Hitler was bogged down in Russia, his ally Japan was busy expanding its empire in the Pacific. Japan had already occupied large parts of China and Indochina. Japan's next target was the resource-rich colonies of Britain, France, and the Netherlands in Southeast Asia, like Malaysia and Indonesia. But there was one major obstacle. The United States Pacific Fleet, stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The United States was still officially neutral, although President Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, wanted to help Britain. The majority of Americans did not want to get involved in another European war. However, the U.S. had imposed sanctions, especially an oil embargo, on Japan to protest its aggression. For resource-poor Japan, the oil embargo was a death sentence. Their war machine would grind to a halt in a matter of months. The Japanese military leaders, headed by Prime Minister Tojo Hideki, decided they had to act. They believed the only way was to launch a devastating surprise preemptive strike against the U.S. fleet, crippling American power in the Pacific long enough for Japan to conquer Southeast Asia and fortify its defenses. On Sunday morning, December 7, 1941, while American soldiers at Pearl Harbor were still sleeping in, hundreds of Japanese warplanes, launched from 6 aircraft carriers, attacked without warning. The attack was a spectacular tactical success. Within 2 hours, the Japanese had sunk or severely damaged 8 battleships, destroyed nearly 200 aircraft, and killed over 2,400 Americans. But strategically, it was a catastrophic blunder. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, who planned the attack, famously said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." He was right. The attack sent a wave of furious outrage across America. The next day, FDR addressed Congress, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. The U.S. Congress voted almost unanimously to declare war on Japan. A few days later, Germany and Italy, in the spirit of brotherhood, also declared war on the United States. The sleeping giant had been awakened. America's massive industrial base shifted into wartime mode. Car factories now produced tanks. Shipyards operated 24/7. Millions of young American men lined up to enlist. The conflict had now truly become a world war. A war on all fronts, from the deserts of Africa to the snows of Stalingrad. With the U.S. in the war, the balance of power began to shift, but the Axis powers still held the upper hand. In North Africa, the war pitted Germany's Afrika Korps, led by the brilliant General Erwin Rommel, nicknamed the Desert Fox, against the British Army. The two sides fought back and forth across the deserts of Libya and Egypt, vying for control of the vital Suez Canal. Finally, at the Battle of El Alamein, late 1942, British General Bernard Montgomery defeated Rommel. Shortly after, American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria. Caught in a pincer movement, the entire German-Italian force in North Africa surrendered in 1943. The Allies had cleaned up Africa and were preparing to invade the soft underbelly of Europe, Italy. In the Atlantic, German U-boats wreaked havoc on Allied convoys, sinking millions of tons of supplies and weapons. At times, Britain was on the verge of starvation, but thanks to the cracking of the German Enigma code and new anti-submarine technology, the Allies gradually gained the upper hand, turning the Atlantic into a graveyard for U-boats. On the Eastern Front, this remained the bloodiest theater of the war. In the summer of 1942, Hitler launched a new major offensive, this time aimed at the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. Hitler was obsessed with capturing the city that bore his enemy's name. The Battle of Stalingrad, late 1942, early 1943, became a symbol of the war's brutality. Fighting raged for every house, every cellar, every pile of rubble. The average life expectancy of a Red Army soldier there was just 24 hours. The Germans captured 90% of the city, but the Red Army stubbornly held on. And then, as winter arrived again, Soviet General Georgy Zhukov launched a surprise counterattack. They didn't strike the city itself, but the German flanks, which were held by weaker Romanian and Hungarian Allied troops. The Soviet pincer closed, encircling the entire German 6th Army, about 300,000 troops, inside Stalingrad. Hitler, in a fit of madness, forbade General Friedrich Paulus from surrendering and promised to resupply him by air. But that promise failed. Starving, freezing, and out of ammunition, the remnants of the German army finally surrendered in February 1943. The Battle of Stalingrad was the decisive turning point of World War II. From this point on, the German army would never recover. The Red Army began its bloody long march, pushing the Germans all the way back to Berlin. The Pacific War, America and Japan's island-hopping showdown. After Pearl Harbor, Japan swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, conquering the Philippines, Singapore, Indonesia, and more. They seemed invincible, but the turning point in the Pacific came much earlier than in Europe. At the Battle of Midway, June 1942, the U.S. Navy, having cracked Japanese naval codes, knew of their plan to attack Midway Island in advance. Despite being outnumbered, the surprise and courage of American dive bomber pilots led to the sinking of 4 of Japan's main aircraft carriers, the very same ones that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Midway was an irreparable loss for the Japanese Navy. They lost their best pilots and carriers. From then on, Japan lost the initiative and was forced onto the defensive. The U.S. began its island-hopping campaign, bypassing heavily fortified islands and capturing only strategically important ones to build airfields, moving ever closer to the Japanese mainland. Battles like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa were incredibly bloody. Japanese soldiers, imbued with the Bushido Code, would rather die than surrender, inflicting horrific casualties on American forces. Kamikaze suicide pilots, crashing their planes into U.S. warships, showed the desperation of their cause. The invasion of the century, D-Day and the Allied Grand Counteroffensive. By 1943, the Allies, led by the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union, had firmly seized the initiative. After taking North Africa, they invaded Sicily and then mainland Italy. Mussolini was overthrown and executed. The German army had to divert forces to occupy Italy, further weakening the Eastern Front. Stalin constantly urged Roosevelt and Churchill to open a second front in Western Europe to relieve pressure on the Red Army. Finally, after months of meticulous planning, the largest amphibious invasion in history was approved. Operation Overlord. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, a massive armada of over 5,000 ships crossed the English Channel, landing 156,000 Allied troops on 5 beaches in Normandy, France. The invasion was supported by thousands of aircraft. The Germans, while expecting an invasion, were tricked into believing it would happen at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel. They were caught by surprise. However, German resistance was still fierce, especially at Omaha Beach, where American forces suffered heavy casualties. But eventually, the Allies established a firm beachhead. Millions of troops and millions of tons of equipment began pouring into France. In August 1944, Paris was liberated. The Allied forces began their advance toward the German border. Caught between 2 pincers, the Red Army from the east and the U.S.-British forces from the west, the end of the Third Reich was near. The final days of the Empire, the final boss, Hitler, and the end in the bunker. In a last, desperate gamble in the winter of 1944, Hitler threw his last reserves into a surprise counteroffensive in the Ardennes Forest, Belgium, hoping to split the Allied forces and force them to sue for peace. This became known as the Battle of the Bulge. Initially, the Germans achieved surprise and made deep advances, but they were ultimately stopped and pushed back by a lack of fuel and overwhelming Allied air power. It was Hitler's final gamble, and he had lost. In early 1945, Allied forces crossed the Rhine River into the heart of Germany. In the east, the Red Army reached the outskirts of Berlin. In his final days, Hitler huddled in an underground bunker, Führer bunker, beneath Berlin, with his most loyal followers. He continued to issue insane orders to armies that no longer existed. Berlin was engulfed in smoke and fire as the Red Army fought street by street. Knowing that all was lost, on April 30th, 1945, Hitler and his partner Eva Braun committed suicide. A few days later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. Throughout the war, another horrific crime was systematically carried out by the Nazis: the Holocaust. Over 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, Slavs, Roma, homosexuals, disabled people, political prisoners, were murdered in concentration and extermination camps like Auschwitz. It remains one of the darkest and most barbaric chapters in human history, a testament to the brutality unleashed by the Nazi ideology. The finale. 2 atomic bombs to close the show. Japan's surrender and the end of the party. Though Germany had surrendered, the war in the Pacific raged on. The Japanese army still had millions of soldiers and vowed to fight to the last man to defend their homeland. An invasion of the Japanese mainland was projected to cause millions of casualties on both sides. The U.S. president was now Harry Truman. Roosevelt had died in April. He faced a difficult decision. The United States possessed a secret weapon of unprecedented destructive power, developed under the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb. Truman decided to use it, hoping to force a quick Japanese surrender and avoid a bloody invasion. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, on the city of Hiroshima. The entire city was flattened in an instant. Over 100,000 people died immediately or in the following days. Japan still did not surrender. On August 9, 1945, the second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. Tens of thousands more were killed. On the same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and attacked the Japanese Kwantung Army in Manchuria. Faced with the terrifying destruction of the new weapon and the Soviet entry into the war, Emperor Hirohito finally decided to intervene. On August 15, 1945, he made a radio address to the nation, announcing Japan's acceptance of unconditional surrender. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japanese representatives formally signed the instrument of surrender. World War II was well and truly over. Epilogue. Cleaning up the battlefield in a world picking sides again. The 6-year-long bloodbath left behind a horrific legacy. An estimated 70 to 85 million people were dead. Many cities in Europe and Asia were reduced to rubble. The world economy was in ruins. World War II completely changed the face of the world. The British and French empires declined. Germany and Japan were occupied and rebuilt. 2 new superpowers emerged: the United States and the Soviet Union. The US was wealthy, powerful, and possessed the atomic bomb. The Soviet Union had the largest army in the world and controlled all of Eastern Europe. Ironically, these 2 former allies against fascism quickly became enemies due to ideological differences. Capitalist democracy versus communism. The world once again split into factions, beginning a new confrontation. Not with direct hot war, but no less tense, known as the Cold War. The great all-in war was over, but it ushered in a new era of suspicion, a nuclear arms race, and a bipolar world. The lesson it left behind remains as valid as ever. The mad ambitions of a few individuals combined with extreme nationalism and the silence of the majority, can plunge all of humanity into an unimaginable catastrophe.